We turn our attention now to the English Reformation. Yesterday we talked about the early Reformation time period. It goes back to the 14th century with John Wycliffe, Johann Huss. These men planted seeds that ultimately, as the 16th century comes around, there is a basic understanding, thanks to the Lollards in England, of what a gospel of grace is about. If you look at the other countries, Germany and Switzerland, they were very, very deeply mired in Catholic tradition and Catholic doctrine. It's helpful to understand that the Catholic Church is so dominant at this time. It's unthinkable that there would be a division. It just is beyond anyone's scope of understanding that, yes, we know the church has its problems. It is corrupt. There are corrupt leaders. They want money for everything that they want to do for us. They interpret the Bible. They tell us the way to heaven. As Phil pointed out this morning, they so taught the people that were part of the church that salvation is a process. It starts with your baptism. You live your life constantly trying to contribute good works, good deeds, stay close to the church, do what we say, and in the end, by the time you die, you're still going to go to purgatory. And the unfortunate thing is people live under the weight of this false doctrine. And when the gospel of grace appears, it's not new. As you've heard over and over again, it is a rediscovery of what the Bible truth was. What the early church understood is that salvation is God's gracious gift to us. You don't work for it. And the sad part of what the Catholic Church has done down through history, including today, is that they take away the glory from God, from Christ, for what they are due. Salvation is wholly of the Lord, and we are grateful for that. Men as sinners would never turn to Christ without a gracious God opening their eyes, as he did for Lydia in Acts 16, and giving us the opportunity to respond to him. That we thank God for. So there's great confusion that has been created by the church, and when I keep saying the church, you know I mean the Roman Catholic Church. And so as we turn our attention now to England, this has a little bit of a different twist on why the Reformation came into being. It's really in large part at the beginning the story of Henry VIII. And so rather than someone like a Luther or a Zwingli or a Calvin coming to the forefront saying, there's a different doctrine, we have discovered through the Greek text what God's word actually says, it wasn't driven that way. Henry has a problem, and probably from your own study of history you realize Henry VIII, when he came onto the scene in the early 1600s, he was the king that had all of these different wives. He had 6 wives. He was a very immoral man. He had many other ladies on the side. He had 6 women that he married. And he's in a desperate hunt, if you will, to get a male heir, a legitimate male heir. Henry had sons that were born, but none of them could take the throne because they did not come through his legitimate wives. So it's Henry's problem in the beginning, and God uses this time as there is a disruption in England away from the Catholic Church. God uses this time to allow the Protestant movement to take hold in England. And there will be, we call it in the United States, fits and starts. In other words, it moves forward, falls back, moves forward, falls back. And we'll try to take a look at that today and not make it too confusing as we look at it. But here on the screen you have Henry VIII. And I put here for William Tyndale. I'm going to, in the optional session at 2:30, talk more about William Tyndale. In many ways, he is the forgotten reformer. We tend to think about Calvin and Luther and Wycliffe and Zwingli and all these other great men and wonderful heroes of the Reformation. and often don't realize the enormous contribution William Tyndale made. So I want to try to address that and help us understand it. So, what are the highlights of the English Reformation? First and foremost, we have a clear translation of the Bible. Thank you to William Tyndale. More on that later. But what happens at the very beginning is that Henry has to have a son to take the throne. In England, there had not been a queen that had ruled yet. And so far, what Henry has through his first wife is only a princess. This would be Queen Mary. She will ultimately take the throne. She'll be known as Bloody Mary. But he has only a female to follow his line to be crowned queen. And there's great worry that that would send the country into turmoil. So he wants a male heir to be able to take the throne as king. He will use kind of an odd thing as his rationale as to why he'll try to get rid of his first wife. And again, more on that in just a minute. You find at the two major universities within England at this time, Oxford and Cambridge, that Lutheran teachings, and when I say Lutheran, I mean from Luther, are now leaving Germany and coming to England. Many students go from England to Germany, and this whole new idea that Martin Luther has introduced is now, they're like seeds in these various pockets in universities, students who are embracing this and meeting and talking about Luther, what Luther is teaching. It will ultimately end up that many will be martyred and killed in England. And so, again, as we progress, you'll see that. Persecution will begin for evangelicals, Protestants, under Henry VIII. It'll be a bit milder than what's coming with his daughter, Queen Bloody Mary. There's a brief period of time, Henry and his third wife does in fact have a son. And he is known as England's Josiah. By God's providence, this young man, Edward VI, is a godly young man. He had great influence by Protestant caretakers. He was schooled in the doctrines of grace, loved great preaching from the Bible, and for 6 years he rules. And that begins the process of Protestantism taking hold in England. He dies at 15 of tuberculosis, and then Henry VIII's daughter, Mary, comes to the throne and reverses everything and puts them back into Catholicism. So it's one of those stories where it moves forward, it comes back, moves forward, but God's hand of providence is on all of this. And then finally, we do have, after Mary dies, Bloody Mary dies, Queen Elizabeth comes to the throne, and there's almost 50 years of Protestantism in England. And then it does take root. Now, let's learn a little bit more about Henry VIII. Henry VIII, if you met him, would have been very, very charming. He was athletic. He was kind of a guy's guy, as we say in the United States, or a man's man. He was a hunter. He was humorous. People loved being around Henry. He was the life of the party. I read a book a couple of years ago on his love letters to Anne Boleyn. And the guy was articulate, he was a romantic, he just seemed like the sort of person that you might want to have a long conversation with. And so as a very young man, at 18, he takes the throne. And he takes the throne, he was the second son of his father. His older brother had been crowned king, King Arthur. And his older brother married a woman named Catherine of Aragon. And she is the daughter of a Spanish royalty. And so they marry, and Arthur dies within a few short months. 4 months into the marriage, Arthur dies. So the father wants to make sure that he would save that line of kingship for his next son, and he arranges it, this is Henry's father, that Henry, who's a very young man at the time, will be preserved to marry Catherine of Aragon. So she waits several years, Henry grows up, and at 18 he marries a much older woman, his brother's wife, or his brother's widow. Now that's the part of the intrigue in the story. Henry and Catherine never have a son that lives past infancy. So Henry believes that his marriage to his brother's widow is a curse from God, and that now she's getting older every day, and he will see that his opportunity to have a son may be fleeting, may be going away. So now he's going to seek to get a divorce from Catherine, and he's going to try to get the divorce from the Catholic Church. And that's the basic story that will create the opportunity for the Reformation to enter England. Having said all that, Henry is a hero within the Catholic Church as well. At the time, he is a contemporary of Luther. I said a minute ago that Lutheran ideas are coming into England. Henry doesn't like that. So Henry writes a booklet, a defense of the sacraments. He writes a book called that basically outlines why Catholic theology is correct. The Pope is so grateful for Henry's defense of the faith that he names him and calls him the defender of the faith. So at this stage, Henry's kind of a hero in England as the king, as a young man with the Catholic Church. But he's got this problem. He wants a male heir. He is going to resist Luther as best he can, Lutheran thought. It's helpful to know, too, Henry's going to ultimately, as the story progresses, Henry's going to ultimately break away from the Roman Church. He's not going to do it because it's a corrupt church. He's not going to do it because he disagrees with their doctrine. He's going to do it because it's the only way to get the divorce he wants. So his reasons for breaking away from the Catholic Church are not spiritual at all. They're a matter of convenience for him. And so Henry is pursuing, he's obsessed with getting this annulment or divorce of his first wife. What you're looking at here is a place known as Hampton Court. And it's always been common for the Catholic hierarchy, from popes and cardinals and bishops, to adorn themselves with great luxury. You are looking at a man's home. Now, it's been built on and added to over the years, but this grand palace, known as Hampton Court, was the residence of Cardinal Wolsey, who is, under Henry, the highest ranking Catholic official in the land. So he has a very close alliance, a very close working relationship with Henry. Remember, the Catholic Church and the civic governments always have this connection, this interweaving that binds them together. And pretty much nobles and kings have learned, I have to get the Catholic Church and then oftentimes the Pope's permission and approval to do certain things. So Henry challenges Wolsey to please go to the Pope, it's Pope Clement at this time, go to the Pope and get an annulment from me so that I can put away Catherine and marry another woman and hopefully have a son. That opportunity for the Catholic Church to see this idea the way Henry does is never going to come. What the Pope does is, like in a sporting event, if you're ahead and you just want to keep the ball away from the other team so that they don't score, we call it running out the clock. What Clement decides to do is never answer Henry. Clement happens to be a prisoner of Charles V. Even as a pope, he's kind of held captive. And Catherine is Charles V. Remember him from the Diet of Worms? That's his aunt. It's his mother's sister. So here he's related to Luther's first wife. And the Pope will not give Henry an annulment or divorce. But he doesn't tell Henry this immediately or straightway. Henry will wait and wait and wait for an answer. He'll get more frustrated. He'll get more angry. But he sends Wolsey to go get an answer. And Wolsey is ineffective at this. I want to pause just for a second as you look at, this is the front picture of Hampton Court. Inside Hampton Court, this is worth looking at. I took these pictures. This is in the Great Hall where banquets would be held. Up in the rafters here, do you have a term called eavesdropping? Is that, looking, they don't, okay. Think of it this way. You're listening secretly to somebody else's conversation. We call it eavesdropping. What it comes from is up in the eaves or up in the rafters, Henry had people planted there listening to conversation of people dining below. They were secretly listening in to what they were talking about, and it was just a way for the king to kind of keep ahead or abreast of what was happening in his kingdom among the various people he would invite to events. It's just an interesting twist as to that's where that saying, it's called eavesdropping, came from, is the people that were up in the rafters listening. But this is a beautiful place. This is one of the stained glasses at Hampton Court, and there is Wolsey's Catholic insignia. He was a cardinal. Now, Henry's going to become so annoyed with the fact that Wolsey cannot get permission for him to divorce his wife that he ultimately takes Hampton Court away from him, and Henry makes it one of his residences. So, as the process continues, this is a little bit more on the explanation. This is Prince Arthur. This is Catherine of Aragon when they married. Again, as I said, she's much older than Henry. Here's a painting of Catherine appealing to Henry in front of Wolsey to please see this differently. Do not divorce me. The only living child they have, and it's noted here, if you go to Hampton Court, you'll see the line of children that were born to Henry and Catherine, and the only living child was Princess Mary. He needs a son. But Mary is still alive, and what Henry will ultimately have to do is to find someone else to have a son with. And his eye falls on a young lady named Anne Boleyn. And the Boleyn family is a respected family within English tradition, and he finds her at court and is smitten with her beauty and her charm, and suddenly now he gets the idea, I really do need to get this divorce. His eyes are set on Anne, and he wants to marry Anne. In the end, Pope Clement refuses to give Henry his annulment. So the answer finally comes, and the answer is no. Well, in the process of this, Anne already understands that Henry wants to marry her. He has expressed his love for her. She refuses to be his mistress. She wants to be legitimately married to him, and he's the king of the country, making serious advances on her, insisting on her marrying him. As it turns out, Wolsey can't get it done. He fires Wolsey, and he then brings on a new Lord Chancellor, a gentleman named Thomas More. You may have heard of him. More is deeply devoted to the Catholic Church, as you would expect him to be. He replaces Wolsey. He's the highest Catholic authority now in the land. So Henry wants him to go get the annulment. More is unable to do it as well. In the process of what will take place over the next several years is Henry will marry Anne. They will come up with fake charges against her that she was adulterous to him because she doesn't deliver a son either. And she's a much younger woman. She has a little girl, and that turns out to be Queen Elizabeth. So then he has her beheaded. This is not a guy you want to marry, by the way. He just tends to marry them and put them away very quickly. His next wife, Jane Seymour, is the one who bears to him, she's the one who bears to him his only living son, and that's Edward VI. He loves Jane deeply because she finally gave him his son. When Henry dies, Edward VI, at 9 years old, takes the throne. But as we continue on, he wasn't satisfied with one son. Jane Seymour dies pretty much at childbirth. She dies very soon. From all that we understand about Jane Seymour's life is she was a Protestant. Anne Boleyn was a Protestant, living with a man who the only thing he had against the Catholic Church and their doctrine was the fact that he couldn't get a divorce. Henry, remember, he wrote a book on a defense of the sacraments. So he himself is wedded to Catholic tradition, Catholic theology, Catholic doctrine. He then decides he's got to get another wife. This is kind of an interesting twist. He needs a wife, and this is, we call them in the United States a mail-order bride. You have a marriage arranged, and this woman comes from Flanders. Her name is Anne of Cleves. And I think he had only seen a very polished picture of her. He had never met her. And when she arrives, he said she had a face like a horse. He wasn't kind either. So, interestingly, rather than to send her back to where she came from and create an international intrigue and international problem, he keeps her in England, puts her into a castle, and pays for her existence. And she was known from that day forth as a sister to the king. So it appeared plausible or amiable, but she never really takes the role of queen. We then have Catherine Howard, which is the next one. He beheads her as well. He keeps coming up with these reasons why, if they don't give him a son, he needs to get rid of them. I don't know how he got anybody to marry him after number 3 or 4. He must have had some great charms. And then finally he marries a much older woman, Catherine Parr, who was also a Protestant, and she outlives him. So she has the distinction of being wife number 6. She outlives him. But that's kind of his travails, all of this for a male heir. Well, Thomas More comes on the scene after Wolsey, and he is a distinguished scholar, and he really has Henry's favor. Henry's idea is, if I can't get the Pope to give me a divorce, then I'm going to break away from the Catholic Church, and we will form our own church, a national church, here in England, and Henry becomes the head of the church. Now here's the easiest way to understand what's happening. Henry does not differ with their doctrine. Henry differs with the decision that they made to not give him the divorce. So when he breaks from the Catholic Church, the Pope excommunicates him. Remember what we said yesterday? That now means they take an eraser and scratch your name out of heaven. You're not coming. So Henry gets excommunicated, but he becomes head of the church. And in so doing, he has to pass a law now in England that says, it's called the Act of Supremacy, that I now am the established, my predecessors and all of my successors as kings and queens, we are head of the church here in England. If you resist this, as Thomas More does, it would be considered an act of treason. The Tower of London, if you've been to London, it's a beautiful city. And the Tower of London is always one of my favorite places to go. If the king had you arrested and sent you to the Tower of London, usually it was a one-way trip. You did not need a round-trip ticket. One way will be fine because usually you didn't come back out. It was really, amongst all the other purposes that it served, it was a prison. And so he sends Thomas More to the Tower. More spends 1 year in captivity, as Henry really is wanting him to think about this. And in the end, More is so devoted to the Catholic Church that he never changes his mind. Henry has him beheaded. It was an act of treason to not accept the fact that Henry was the supreme head of the church. Henry now gets someone that Anne Boleyn had recommended. This gentleman had been the chaplain to her family, and his name is Thomas Cranmer. Interestingly, Cranmer is going to become on the scene as one who aids the Reformation in England, but he does not have the dominant, outgoing way that a Martin Luther does. He comes in a more subtle fashion. As he takes over now under Henry, Henry has got this big church now he has to attend to. Henry goes in and seizes Catholic land. If you read, going back to Wycliffe's time, depending upon what you read, the Catholic Church had half to 2/3 of all the deeded land in England was owned by the Catholic Church. When you think about that, that is astounding how much money that they would have had in value, but also rent payments or payments from those who would use the fields. It's amazing how much money over time the Catholic Church has taken in from those they were intended to serve. They usually extract a lot of money from. Whether you're poor or rich, it doesn't matter. Give us your money. And so Henry takes monasteries and churches, and they're now part of England. Tough luck to the Catholic Church. So he has to have somebody now who can organize what this new Church of England is going to look like. And he calls upon Thomas Cranmer, who now replaces Thomas More, and he is Archbishop of Canterbury. He will be the highest ranking authority on the church in England under Henry. Cranmer recognizes he's got a major problem on his hands. And this is helpful as you look at the Reformation to remember this, is that as changes take place at the top, prominent figures come on the scene like a Martin Luther or a John Calvin, and they are strong in doctrine. They can read the scriptures and interpret the scriptures well and preach the scriptures. But you still have a lot of people in churches out in rural areas, or just in the churches where the person in the pulpit, whether you would call them a priest, as the Church of England will continue to do, or whether you call them pastor, just because the church changed at the top didn't mean you were instantly informed of everything that the Protestants believed. And so what Cranmer will have to do is create the Book of Common Prayer, which is really a doctrinal position of how do you conduct worship services in a Protestant manner. And if you were a priest out in somewhere the hinterland, far away from London, this book would be valuable because you now, if you would want to live in the manner of the new church and conduct yourself under the new way of doing this, that book would be crucial to you because you didn't just instantly see it on the news. They didn't have TV back then. So here we have Cranmer. Cranmer grants to Henry the annulment. And frankly, it's a little bit behind the times because he and Anne have already secretly been married. Anne is now pregnant, Anne Boleyn. Cranmer gives the official annulment as now Archbishop of Canterbury. He gives the annulment. They now have an official public wedding, and she is now queen. So Cranmer did believe in one thing, and that is to be loyal to the king. And he serves the king very, very well. And frankly, he is an enormous help in the early days to getting what the Church of England will become as they make a movement slowly, but they'll make the movement towards Protestantism. The part of the story that's a bit troubling is Henry is not willing to move away from Catholic doctrine. That wasn't his problem. And so now you've got Cranmer kind of operating in some ways independently of what both Henry will know. He's going to do his best to get an English Bible into these churches. And so he's going to do a lot to be helpful in moving forward with the Protestant movement in England. So Henry breaks with Rome. It's the birth of the Anglican Church. Henry dies in 1547. And when Henry dies, the son that was born to him from Jane Seymour, Edward VI, takes over. Now Henry dies in 1547. Luther dies in 1546. So Henry VIII and Luther lived in the same time frame. By the way, so does Tyndale, William Tyndale. So Edward VI, this young son at age 9, is crowned king. When you were that young, you obviously have to have those surrounding you who would really protect you in the sense of helping you make decisions of what a king should do. He would have advisors. And fortunately, he is surrounded by those who embrace the Reformation. And this young boy is just remarkable in, by God's timing, him coming on the scene and taking what had started under Cranmer and Henry, kind of behind the scenes with Henry, Cranmer moving things forward. Now you can come fully forward forward and bring the Reformation, Protestant thinking, this new way of both preaching and understanding how to be right with God. That now can take hold in England. Great preachers emerge. Hugh Latimer. You have John Knox, who Edward VI loved hearing preach. And we'll talk about Knox tonight. But this young man loved preaching so much that right outside of his balcony, which this is, I know it's probably hard to see at the back, but this is where young King Edward would sit, and he had a place built right outside of his balcony so that preachers could come and he would sit and listen to preaching. He so loved Protestant preaching and was so much a part of what was taking place for the Reformation, even as a very young teenager, that preaching and the preaching of God's Word now becomes very clear, and this is an exciting time for England. Well, unfortunately, Edward VI has a problem, and he gets very, very sick. He will die at age 15. He's only on the throne for 6 years. He will die of tuberculosis. And his idea, recognizing this, the next in line, if he dies, to take the throne, is the daughter of Henry and Catherine. Remember, she got put away. She was the one that was divorced. When the annulment came, Henry sent her off to a faraway castle. She had to come often and come to court, ask for money. Her daughter, Princess Mary, thought her mother had been very mistreated. And in fact, when her mother got sent away, Mary was not allowed to see her mother again. So Mary is the next one in line, and she is a devout Catholic. So this young man, on his deathbed, devises a means by which, by his hand, by his declaration, here is his note, he calls it his scheme for succession, is by his decree as a king, he's going to skip over Mary, and he's going to name a cousin of his, young Lady Jane Grey. And this young 18-year-old woman is very much a Protestant. She is a believer. She has been recently married. She's 18. She's the cousin. And he appoints her next in line to take the throne. But he does this for the safekeeping of the church in England so that they could continue to make progress. This was his idea upon his death of how to preserve what had already been started. Edward dies. Lady Jane Grey they call her the 9 days queen. The reason is she was only in the role for 9 days. This young woman falls, unfortunately, to how strong the Catholic position still was within England. And this is an interesting piece of the story in most of these countries. Remember, the people who would fill the churches, they don't understand a lot of what's going on. It will take years of being taught and having good preaching and good teaching, those who will come to Christ, to kind of understand what this big difference is between the grace of God and a works-based religion. Well, there is a stronghold within England that is still very Catholic. They're disappointed in what Henry did. They are very much Catholic. And his young daughter, Princess Mary, is very Catholic. She pretty much just rides into London with enough of a force to be able to take over, claim her right as queen. There's no opposition to that. And so Queen Mary, the first child that was born to Henry, is now crowned queen. And unfortunately, she executes Lady Jane Grey because she assumed the throne and she felt like that she shouldn't have. There's more to the story, and part of what we're doing and having to compress things is, I can't really get into some of the other ideas. Ironically, Mary tries very hard to get Lady Jane Grey to avoid killing her. I think she felt sorry for her. That she tries her best. She sends priests in to have Lady Jane Grey convert to Catholicism, and that might make a difference. And and this young 18-year-old lady entrusted her life to Christ, and she went to the gallows as a believer, but not wanting to deny her Lord, and so she passed on that, and she was executed. Well, Mary comes to the throne. There are, unfortunately, in English and Scottish history, a lot of Marys. And I know when you hear about this, you're trying to figure out Queen Mary, Mary Queen of Scots, Mary of Guise, you've got all these Marys. Just remember this, the daughter of King Henry, Princess Mary, becomes Queen Mary after Edward VI dies. She's the one who will be known as Bloody Mary. The reason is she comes to the throne with a hatred of the Protestant reformers. She blames them for what happened to her mother. She blames them for basically the break with Rome. And so in her few 5 to 6 years of reigning, she brings back Catholicism. And there's a nation ready to embrace this. And in the process, Mary, in seeking revenge, will systematically take many of these prominent reformers, Hugh Latimer, Nicholas Ridley, John Rogers, Cranmer, and she will execute them. This is her way of revenging herself. Now, let me put a pause on the story just for a second. You'll find this interesting. At this time, if you stayed in England as a reformer, the likelihood of you living was not real good. So a number of the reformers, John Knox, John Fox, who you'll meet in the next slide, a number of English reformers made the decision to flee England and go to Geneva, a free city. Who's in Geneva? John Calvin. And so there is a very large English-speaking church in Geneva that John Knox will pastor and teach and lead in Geneva. And they're all escaping the reign of Queen Mary because she is putting hundreds of believers to the stake and burning them to death. This is her revenge on the Reformation. So, many choose to flee. They are called, because of her name, Marian exiles. So many leave, many stay. And if they stay, they pretty much were dealt with in a very harsh manner. She does her best to revive Catholicism again in the country. Now, a person that you've probably heard about over time is a gentleman named John Fox. You might have sometimes in your readings come across a quotation or biographical sketch from Fox's Book of Martyrs. And Fox had many, many friends. Fox was one of the ones who decided to go to Geneva. But many of his closest associations and friends stayed behind and were executed, persecuted, tortured. Many bad things happened to just wonderful believers who made the decision to stay behind. And so he creates this book to remember them, to bring honor to those who faithfully were persecuted and faithfully martyred. This book starts off small. It's kind of like Calvin's Institutes. And by the time he's finished after 4 volumes, it's 1,800 pages. In the section on Tyndale alone, it's 8 pages. So Fox is a historian, and he doesn't want the world to forget the great sacrifice that these wonderful believers made and how ugly the persecution was from Bloody Mary. Well, one of the people that Mary decides to kill, her very first martyr, is a pastor named John Rogers. He has a lot to do with publishing the Matthew's Bible. He was a friend of Tyndale's, and he is burned at the stake in Smithfield, very close to his church. You also have 2 other people that come to prominence in the English Reformation. One is Nicholas Ridley. Ridley is 55 years old, and Hugh Latimer, who is one of the greatest preachers that was produced through the Reformation in England. Both both of them, one at 55, one at 70. Mary rounds them up. She arrests Cranmer, and she puts both Latimer and Ridley to the stake together, chains them together there at Oxford. They're burned at the stake, and she forces Cranmer to watch what happens to his friends because he's next. Cranmer has this odd situation in that they are given usually an opportunity to recant. Now, that might only buy you in the next life, according to Catholic theology. It might buy you a little bit more grace, but Mary's just as likely to put you to death, even if you recant. So under Catholic theology, you might go into the next life, go into death, go into purgatory, with less on your held against you. So Cranmer, this wonderful stalwart, when he's faced with his charges, he recants. And then he has second thoughts and realizes what he's done. I think he was humiliated in his heart. He was embarrassed by what he had done. And so he is given an opportunity before his execution to speak to everyone there, basically to say the Catholics win, and even though I'm going to go to my death, I want you to know that I was wrong in believing what the Protestant movement was about and what the Reformers taught. And he uses that opportunity, he changes again, and he uses that opportunity to preach Christ and to say, no, I align myself with this, I was wrong to ever recant. And they send him to the fires as well. So Mary has just a terrible time. It's estimated that there's some 400 reformers that she put to death, most of them by burning at the stake. What's happening at this time, too, is of the two major universities, you have these great, great universities, Oxford and Cambridge. Of the two, the place where the Reformation seems to be just flourishing is in Cambridge. And so at Cambridge, you have this tavern nearby called the White Horse Inn, and this is where these young men gather who are part of Cambridge, who are studying, or who pastor nearby, and they come together and they meet here, and they are learning and understanding more of what the Bible teaches. It is a great way that they encourage each other, and some of the men that were either coming to Christ as a result of meeting there with, in the White Horse Inn, or those who are strengthened in their faith, you'll notice some great, great reformers that are there. William Tyndale comes to Christ as a result of the White Horse Inn. So this place became, really, they called it Little Germany, because they were discussing so much of what Luther had brought to the forefront. It was a fertile ground for the Protestant movement, and much of what takes place, really, in England, really started there by these great men who encouraged each other. Well, Queen Mary dies, and when Mary dies, the next one in line of Henry's children is Queen Elizabeth. And Queen Elizabeth was the only living child of the marriage from Anne Boleyn and Henry. It's Queen Elizabeth. Queen Elizabeth was a brilliant lady. She spoke several languages. They said that she read daily from a Greek New Testament herself. That's like having your devotions by using a Greek Bible. So she was a very smart lady. She comes to the throne with her core being in a reformed mindset. This is a good thing. But she also comes to the throne of a divided nation. You have this strong contingent who still want to hang on to Catholic theology and Catholic doctrine. It's all they've ever known. They trust it. And then you've got this movement that began really under Cranmer and many of the other leaders, and then flourished under Edward VI. You've got this other contingent of believers who want to see England go in the direction of being fully Protestant. So you have a divided nation. One of the ways that Queen Elizabeth has been looked at is that she tried her best to kind of go down the middle path. They call her the middle way queen, or the Elizabethan settlement. Was her idea of trying to unite the country by trying to please both sides. In the process of trying to please both sides, guess what happens? Neither side is happy with you, because you're trying to play between both. So she keeps with the doctrine that Cranmer and others had helped to put into the church, but she now infuses in some of the things that pleases the Catholics. Things like rituals. The priests would wear vestments and garb that would remind them of Catholic priests. There would be kneeling during the time of the Lord's table or communion. All of these are kind of trappings from the old Catholic way, but she very much would in fact try to endorse Protestant doctrine, Protestant theology. So she tried to mix the two. And in the process, the nation began to strengthen, but she is remembered as one who really didn't go classically hard in one direction or the other. Now, I want to take just for a moment, I'm going to spend a little bit more time this afternoon on the English Bible and William Tyndale and Erasmus. But I think it's important to know the foundation to what takes place in England, in large part, would have not happened the way it did unless there had been a Bible in the hands of the people that they could read. And the person who is largely responsible for that is William Tyndale. And his greatest contribution to the Reformation, to the church, was an English Bible. He was trained as a priest, and as he came to understand the grace of God and became a believer, he was passionate about wanting to see the Bible in the hands of the English people so that they could read for themselves and grow. If you became a Christian and didn't have access to the Bible, you'd be limited as to how to understand what God would expect of us and how to live and how to conduct our lives. And so as a young man, after he graduates from university, he goes to work as a tutor and a chaplain to a wealthy nobleman's home. And he lives with a family, and the family name is John Walsh. He becomes a tutor to Walsh's children, and he's there as kind of their own chaplain, and he begins to preach in nearby churches. But one of the things that happens to Tyndale when he in fact spends time with the Walsh family is the Walsh family entertains a wide variety of people at dinner. And he is famous for the statement that a Catholic priest came to dine with the Walsh family. And the Catholic priest made the statement that we are better off with the Pope's teaching than having a Bible. And this just infuriated Tyndale. And he said, I will make it my life work that even a boy that his hand is at the plow will know more about the Bible than you do, and the Pope would. And he really made it his mission, I have to get an English Bible, a Bible in English, in the hands of the people. Well, he goes to basically the source in London. He goes to one of the people in the hierarchy there in London, Tunstall. And Tunstall had helped Erasmus get his Greek New Testament printed. Tyndale goes to him thinking, if I offer to make an English Bible, would he be likely to give me permission so that I can stay here in England and complete the work? Tunstall refused and wanted no part of it, and he basically created a situation where he commanded Tyndale to not to go forward with his work. And so Tyndale will have to leave England and go to the continent and find a place to complete his work and find a place to get his Bibles printed. You can see here just the beauty of some of the original Tyndale New Testaments that were printed. His very first completion was in 1526 of a New Testament. He is traveling all over Europe trying to find printers and not get caught. During his lifetime, Henry VIII had at any one time 5 to 6 spies all over Europe going to these printing places where a lot of printing were taking place. That was in Mainz, Germany, in Cologne, even Wittenberg had its own printers, in Belgium. So Tyndale is moving around trying to not get caught and trying to continue to take his original work and continue to revise it. But he becomes a hunted man. Now the interesting thing is we often think of these reformers as very old people, that they kind of live a long, rich life, and you know, if they get martyred, they were older anyway. What's interesting about the majority of Tyndale's life as he pursued putting a Bible in the hands of the people, he's going to be executed at age 42. So in his 30s, this is when really the bulk of his translation work took place. He is in Belgium, and he's found kind of a home there. He's able to produce Bibles. What they're doing is taking the Bibles that are being printed in Belgium, and Tyndale had some relationships with some of the people in the ports of London, and they would hide these Bibles that were being printed in bales of cotton and in other cargo that the ships would take across the channel and to bring into London. And so they were hiding Bibles in the cargo. And so there was an arrangement there at the port that those who were sympathetic to Tyndale and the Reformation movement would take these Bibles and get them distributed around England. Henry knew this, and he wanted the Bible out of England. So that's why he had men hunting down Tyndale, trying to find him so that they could arrest him and basically try him. Well, Tyndale is betrayed. He agrees to meet a young man named Phillips, and he agrees to meet him. Phillips is waiting for him kind of outside the door where Tyndale was doing his work. Tyndale comes out to meet Phillips. Phillips has got some soldiers right there with him, and they arrest Tyndale. Tyndale then goes to basically a jail within a castle in Belgium. He spends almost a year and a half in jail in some of the worst conditions you can imagine. And this is actually a note. This is Tyndale's own note to the warden there of that jail, asking him for candles, because he sits in the dark at night. And as he says in his letter, it's wearisome to sit at night in the dark. He was also asking for his Hebrew text. He wants to continue. Here he is in jail, awaiting a very bad ending, and yet he wants to continue his work. So he's trying to continue on with the Hebrew translation for the Old Testament. He also asked for some help, things that would help him mend his socks and his leggings. He's in a very damp, dark, wet, cold spot. One of the best biographies you can read on William Tyndale is by a professor named Danielle. And there's a video that he has produced as well, and it just sticks in my mind that he said, here you have the leading scholar in all of Europe sitting in the dark at night. And he was just, in a sense, it was a very sad way for him to come to the end of his life. But as Tyndale is then dealt with, they take him outside after 500 days of holding him. They're going to continue with basically the sentencing, the execution. They tie an iron chain around his neck to strangle him. That was, I guess, a mark of grace rather than to let you be burned to death in the flames. And then they set fire, and he is burned to death at the stake. But one of the things he says there, and that is in his dying moments, the last recorded thing that we have him saying is, Lord, open the eyes of the King of England. Here his last thought was of the Bible getting into England. Change the King's heart so that we can get these Bibles freely throughout England, not having to smuggle them. And ironically, about 2 years after his death, his friends who took his transcripts continued his work, and they found that now the Bible is in England. And Henry approved it, and so even though he was chasing Tyndale, little did Henry know that 85% of the translation work that Tyndale had done has found its way into the Bibles that he's going to put in English churches. So Tyndale's prayer was answered. We remember him because, let me just show you something quickly here. I have just a few minutes. What's what we talked about yesterday. Miles Coverdale was a friend to Tyndale, and he was one of the people who gathered up what was left behind by Tyndale after his death, got to Geneva, and became part of the editorial group. John Calvin, Theodore Beza, John Knox, Miles Coverdale, they all came together to produce the Geneva Bible. So ironically, even though Tyndale had died, he had been executed, his life work was not set aside. It will be fulfilled by these men And so they go to work with various translations. Let me walk you through some of them. You have the Coverdale Bible. That will find its way into England. Cranmer put this Bible before Henry. Henry said, make sure it doesn't have heresy in it, didn't really get into it himself. They had a review board, and the Coverdale Bible, which was William Tyndale's work, is now the Great Bible that will be in London. You have the Geneva, which we talked about last night, the first study Bible. Then you have, later, Tyndale's work will find its way into the King James. Now, I'm going to hold this to our Scottish talk tonight, because King James is in the family of Queen Elizabeth. With Queen Elizabeth's death, there is no other Tudor or no other Henry VIII descendant to be able to take the throne. And so they will go to Scotland to a relative, King James, and he will become King of all England in not only Scotland but also England. And so he will not necessarily be open to the Geneva Bible. He will want to get it out of the country. And so we'll pick up the story tonight. But even the King James, the majority of the work that is done to produce that Bible was done by Tyndale. So I think it's right for us to acknowledge the fact that Tyndale played such an amazing role. Even though he met a martyr's death, the contribution he made to the Bible being in England, the Bible that we enjoy today, the translations that have even gone into other languages, have been a result of the great work that Tyndale has done. So we are grateful for that. At 2:30 today, there's an optional session we'll do. It's not required that you feel like you have to be there. But I want to talk a little bit more about how Tyndale came to the forefront, as well as the person who gave the basis for the work that was able to be done by Luther and even Tyndale, and that is Erasmus. We want to just talk about how they tie together.